like to pay tribute to Bezo Toon and Robert in particular. You realize what he's doing by sponsoring an event on Greece when Greece is facing such a crisis. You come here, and you should, if you don't every time you come, leave with a $20 bottle of Palestinian olive oil. Increasingly, we are going to have to, the international lab, be buying Greek olive oil in order to promote their exports in light of the steps they're about to take. So he's sponsoring an event for a competitor. Secondly, it's very, I think, significant that on the week of the referendum, that this event should be organized by the Real News. I don't know, maybe you know it, but apart from having conceived and run Face Off and Counterspin, those of us who used to appear on Face Off used to call it Fuck Off. Paul J. was a masterful documentary filmmaker. And apart from making films on Albania and the invention of the machine gun, he made a remarkable film, I think his best, called Never Ending Referendum. And I hope what we're not going to be facing in Greece is Never Ending Referendum. That was about Quebec, of course. It's not impossible that this referendum will not resolve things. And I'll talk about that a bit. Things have obviously been coming to a head. This remarkable party, which has been developing for 25 years in Greece, didn't come out of nowhere. Embedded itself in the anti-globalization movement beginning of this millennium, and did so in a way that wasn't parasitic on the movements, that wasn't just involving itself in them in order to pull in key members, as so many small far-left parties do. When, as the crisis grew greater and greater, it made it very clear that it was prepared, and this caused this breakthrough, in fact, to form a government with anybody that would stop the torture. That this wasn't a left party that was just trying to get another 5, 10, 15% of the polls to lay a basis for an eventual long-term breakthrough. But such was the crisis that, such was what the Greek people were going through in this depression that had been imposed on them, that they would form a government with anybody. And they almost on that basis won in 2012. And when they did come very, very close to winning a majority, this January, they formed a government with a relatively right-wing nationalist, not the fascists, that go beyond, but a relatively right-wing nationalist party, which just took them over the top. I must say that has not constrained them socially. Just last week, they passed a very important piece of legislation which will give the children of migrants to Greece, refugees to Greek citizenship. The right-wing party in the government did not vote for it. So it didn't hold the government back in that respect, and they were able to carry it with the votes of a small party called the River and some Pasok votes. So that's significant. The party has always tried to square the circle in an impossible kind of way. Its politics have been, we have to stop neoliberal austerity, we have to stop Europe being neoliberal. At the same time, however, at all costs, we want to stay in Europe. This is a matter of, they never would have gotten elected had they not said that. And being in Europe also involves being in the Eurozone, as far as they're concerned. But the leadership actually is instinctively Europeanist and internationalist. So their own orientation is ideological orientation, personal orientation is oriented that way. The trouble is the European Union has neoliberalism in its DNA. Not just the economic and monetary unions between going on since 1985, that eventually produced the common currency, but going all the way back to the beginning, to the Treaty of Rome in some ways in 1958, which established the first free trade zone in Europe. The implication always was what we recognize in NAFTA or in the WTO as a commitment to free capital movements, free trade, etc. It's been a capitalist Europe. And although there have been socialist, or at least social welfare elements attached to it, and certainly there have been important human rights dimensions to the European Union, at its core, that's what it's been. So how do you square this circle? Has always been the dilemma of Syriza. The negotiations we've seen over the course of the last months have been about trying to square that circle. And that's why it dragged on to such an extent. In this dragging on, as I've said on the news a number of times, based on what I could see when I was there in May, a state of suspended animation developed, or did develop. What the Minister of Education Culture said to me was an immobilized movement. Not that people weren't supportive of the government, they were overwhelmingly, right? But that the movements weren't in motion, kind of holding their breath to see what happened. Well, things have really come to an end. And even before Tsipras finally broke off the negotiations on the last weekend, there was already an indication that the movements were moving again, at least in the sense of protest movements in the streets. This to some extent was started by the right. You may have seen 2 weeks ago, demonstrations in Greece organized by the right. Some people say organized by some of the same international organizers who organized the Maidan rallies in the Ukraine, in Kiev. In any case, you saw some banners that said, "We do not want a Stalinist Greece." And this brings you all the way back to the Civil War in Greece, right? Between the left and the right. There were some mobilizations by the Communist Party, the KKE, also against the government. There were smaller demonstrations by the movements that supported Syriza, encouraged by Syriza, and so on. Well, with the announcement of the referendum, there was today a very large demonstration in St. Michael Square, 20,000 people, twice as large as the previous one a week ago. This has had the effect of generating some movement. I think what Dimitri described so well needs to be seen as class struggle. If you read the notations on what Syriza came forward with in the last 2 weeks, it's so interesting to see class struggle inscribed in what the technicians for the IMF and European finance ministers were striking out. You can see it on the internet. It was leaked. Were striking out on the documents. They were striking out a proposal that the lowest sales tax should be on basic foods, and inserting that, instead of 6% on basic foods, there should be a 13% tax on processed foods. Well, processed foods is what poor people eat. They wanted to reduce the rate of corporate tax that Syriza wanted to increase from 26% to 29%. They struck that out and wrote 28%. Syriza had proposed a 12% special tax, a one-time tax on profits over a certain amount, from which, however, farmers would be exempted. They wanted to wipe out that tax. And they also wanted farmers not to be exempted from the increased corporate taxes. So you see that this was an explicit class struggle going on. And it's going on that way also because the capitalist state has, the power of classes are inscribed, or the lack of power, are inscribed in its own accounting mechanism. It's true, if you're going to collect the sales tax, you know that you can collect it on people who have to buy the basic foods to survive. You know you're going to get that money. Right? If you're going to try to collect a tax on profits, a 12%, you're not sure you're going to get it. And you see the class struggle that was involved here. So finally, when the cabinet met, the inter-cabinet met and said, no, we cannot possibly do this, they were in some sense coming to some sort of a recognition that it's impossible to square this circle. It was clear to them, in any case, that had they signed on to this bad agreement, and a lot of people in the party were expecting that they would, that the party would implode. It would have, in all kinds of directions. Right? It would have imploded. So, in calling this referendum, and not only in calling it in a way that says, give us the mandate to sign that agreement, but to say, no, they want us to sign that agreement, we want a vote from you that endorses our rejection of it. And they're mobilizing that way. It's very significant. That said, even if they win, and the latest opinion poll, as of 6 o'clock tonight, I talked to my friend who spoke in Michalis Purgalakis just before I came at 1:30 Athens time. A poll was released that was conducted up to 6 o'clock Greek time tonight, which showed that 53% will vote no, and 31% will vote yes. And this is quite different than the polls we've been seeing coming from the right-wing press. And he tells me this is a very reputable pollster. It's actually written by a guy who's not a leftist, it's someone who's a rightist, but he's an honest, reputable guy. That said, he says that the momentum is moving in the other direction. And astonishingly, the Communist Party, the KKE, has announced that they will abstain by dropping the ballots from the last election into the election box, rather than vote on the referendum. Antarcia, the far left party, which gets less than 1% of the vote in the election of far left groups, however, well, you know, say, you see, we told you, you know what the European is, you should have imposed capital controls from the beginning, the moment you were elected, which is what they were calling for. They are mobilizing for a no vote, of course. Well, we'll have to see what happens. The significant thing, maybe the more significant than the referendum that's happened, is that by virtue of breaking off the negotiations, by virtue of the negotiations around whether to see through the old agreement that the old memorandum the previous government had signed, that's off the books now. The effect of that was to make it clear that the banking system could not survive. And they've had to introduce capital control. And that already, I think, gives them more breathing room. At the same time, of course, it frightens people, right, about the implications of that. Right? But there's no way that one can engage in the type of change. It's not even just socialism that we're talking about in some abstract sense. You know, now there's no way of getting out of neoliberalism probably without it. There's probably no way of getting out without it. And then that really should concentrate the mind. I don't think many of us think about this. Any one of us would have taken on to an ATM this weekend, just in order to get the money to survive during this week. It wasn't just a matter that, you know, these are people who, you know, are against the government, they're trying to make things worse. No, we're all part of this system. And we all suffer when it goes into a complete freeze. So this is very difficult. No matter what the outcome, I don't think things will be resolved as of next Sunday. Obama has been on the horn to Merkel, putting enormous pressure on them not to let Greece go. They're very worried about it geostrategically, especially given what's going on in Eastern Europe. They're worried about the cascading effects of a Greek banking crash. There's already some signs that the largest Greek bank, which has subsidiaries in the Balkans and in Turkey, that its Turkish subsidiary may be in big trouble, may collapse. Now, you may think that that's hurt Syriza, On the contrary, it seems to me that it indicates that the kind of sense that they've had, well, we don't have to worry if there's a big banking crisis that it may not cause a cascading effect any longer. I think they are worried about that. And certainly what happened in the stock markets in Europe today, and even to the banking stocks on Wall Street, is an indication that they're worried about it. So I do think that the American empire wants the EU to contain this. Is that the best outcome? I mean, were they to get a no vote and sit down again and work out some greater compromise that would not be quite as draconian, but wouldn't give Greece the investment funds they need to get out of this depression that they've been thrown into, wouldn't wipe out a large part of the debt, but the investment funds are more important. This would not be a great outcome. The big trouble is that were they to break, and this comes back to what Paul was saying right at the very end in terms of Baltimore, the big question is whether the left there, even with that remarkable party that's developed, whether the left there has the capacity to not just protest, which the left's good at, especially in Greece. Incredible politicized in that sense. It's one of the things that's most exciting about going there. But whether they have the capacity to do the things that Paul was talking about, that is, start to construct an alternative economy. Do they have those talents? Do they have the animators who could sit down with small and medium enterprises, with municipal governments, and begin to plan ways you could reconstruct production that could put the 25% of people who are unemployed to work, that could put the 45% of young people to work. In that sense, I think we all ought to be very, very honest. Ernie said to me yesterday, well, if they don't have the ability to do this, Ernie Tate was sitting here asked the question, then none of us have the ability to do this. And I think that that's how we got to be looking at it, and not in a smart-ass way, in which we say, oh, they screwed up, or oh, this is very difficult stuff, not just in terms of facing the powers that face it, but in terms of asking themselves, do they have the talent and creativity to be able to construct a different type of economy?
Just to give you a concrete example of what he was talking about, the capital controls that have been imposed limit withdrawals from the ATMs to 60 euros a day. And people who have a foreign debit card or credit card are not subject to that limit because Greece is entering the critical tourist season and they don't want to prevent, obviously, people who are drawing on funds from outside of the Greek banking system from spending that money. And just think about the practical implications of that. How do you have to stop banking for some period of time and reset all of the ATMs in the country so that people can't withdraw more than 60 euros a day in a 24-hour period, but exempting non-Greek debit cards and credit cards. That small task, which is just a minute part of the immense challenges facing the government, would in and of itself require some very careful thinking, consultation with technical experts and so forth. So it's a massive undertaking, but I do agree with the sentiment that if they can't do it, then who can? It has to be attempted, in my view, at great cost, unfortunately.